David walked through the glass doors of TechFlow Solutions every morning with a spring in his step that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Back then, he was just another face in the crowd, a junior operations assistant who spent his days organizing files and scheduling meetings for people who barely acknowledged his existence. But things had changed dramatically since those early days. The transformation didn't happen overnight. David had always been smart, perhaps too smart for his own good. He noticed things others missed and had an uncanny ability to predict what his bosses wanted before they even knew it themselves. While his colleagues focused on completing their assigned tasks, David studied the bigger picture. He watched how decisions were made, who held real influence, and most importantly, how to position himself at the center of it all. His first breakthrough came during a company crisis 18 months into his employment. A major client was threatening to cancel their contract due to repeated delivery delays. While everyone else panicked, David quietly worked through the weekend to identify the real problem in their supply chain. But instead of presenting his findings to his immediate supervisor, he bypassed 2 levels of management and went straight to the operations director during a company meeting. The move was bold. Some would say reckless, but it paid off spectacularly. The operations director was impressed by David's initiative and analytical skills. More importantly, David had learned a valuable lesson about corporate politics. Sometimes breaking the rules got you noticed in ways that following them never could. From that moment, David began building his reputation as someone who got results. He volunteered for challenging projects that others avoided, and always seemed to have solutions when problems arose. But what his colleagues didn't realize was how calculated every move had become. David kept detailed notes on everyone's strengths and weaknesses. He knew who had influence with senior management and who was struggling in their roles. He became a master at office politics without anyone realizing it. When colleagues shared their concerns or frustrations with him, David listened carefully and filed away every piece of information. He never used it maliciously, at least not obviously. Instead, he positioned himself as the person who understood how things really worked around the office. David's networking skills were impressive. He remembered personal details about everyone, from the security guard's daughter's graduation to the CFO's golf handicap. He made himself useful to people at every level of the organization. Need someone to organize the office holiday party? David volunteered. Looking for someone to represent the company at a trade conference? David was available. But perhaps his greatest talent was making other people's ideas sound like his own without technically lying. During team meetings, he had a gift for listening to suggestions from quieter colleagues and then rephrasing them in a way that made him appear to be the original thinker. He never directly stole credit, but somehow he always seemed to be the one who got remembered when promotions were being discussed. The company culture at TechFlow Solutions was competitive, but not cutthroat. Most employees were decent people who wanted to do good work and advance their careers through honest effort. This environment actually worked in David's favor because his manipulative tactics were subtle enough to fly under the radar. His colleagues saw him as ambitious and results-driven, not realizing how carefully he orchestrated his success. When the senior operations manager position opened up unexpectedly, David wasn't the most obvious candidate. There were others with more experience and longer tenure with the company, but David had spent months preparing for this opportunity. He had built relationships with key decision-makers and positioned himself as the innovative problem solver the company needed for its next phase of growth. The interview process was rigorous, but David excelled. He presented detailed plans for improving efficiency and reducing costs. He spoke confidently about leadership philosophy and team building. Most importantly, he had done his homework on each person conducting the interview. He knew their priorities, their concerns, and exactly what they wanted to hear. When the announcement came that David had been promoted to senior operations manager, it surprised some people, but not those who had been paying attention. He had been building toward this moment for 2 years, and everything had fallen into place exactly as he had planned. The promotion came with significant responsibilities. David would now oversee a team of 15 people and manage client relationships worth millions of dollars. He had his own office, a substantial salary increase, and most importantly, real authority within the organization. For the first time in his career, he didn't have to manipulate situations from the sidelines. He could make decisions that directly impacted the company's success. But power, even legitimate power earned through hard work and smart positioning, can be intoxicating. David had spent so long maneuvering and strategizing to reach this position that he had forgotten how to simply do good work for its own sake. Everything had become about advancement, influence, and control. His new role gave him access to information and resources he had never had before. He could see detailed financial reports, client communications, and strategic planning documents. This level of insight into the company's operations was fascinating, but it also fed his growing sense that he understood the business better than most of his superiors. David's confidence in his abilities wasn't entirely misplaced. He was intelligent, hardworking, and genuinely talented at his job. The problem was that success had started to convince him that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't necessarily apply to him. After all, hadn't he already proven that unconventional approaches could lead to extraordinary results? The team he inherited was generally competent and hardworking. Most of them had been with the company longer than David, and some had initially expected to be considered for the promotion themselves. But David's charm and political skills served him well in winning them over, at least initially. He held team meetings where he listened to everyone's input and made them feel valued. He implemented some of their suggestions and gave them credit publicly. For the first few months, everything seemed to be going perfectly. David's team was productive, client relationships were strong, and senior management was pleased with his performance. But underneath the surface, something was changing. The same ambition and strategic thinking that had elevated David to this position were starting to evolve into something more dangerous. He began to see himself not just as a successful manager, but as someone who was essential to the company's continued success. The line between confidence and arrogance was starting to blur, and David was about to discover just how far that transformation would take him. 6 months into his new role, David's management style began to shift in ways that his team members noticed, but couldn't quite put their finger on. The change was gradual, like watching someone's personality slowly transform over time. What started as confidence had begun morphing into something else entirely. The first sign was how David started handling team meetings. In the beginning, he had genuinely listened to input from his staff and implemented their suggestions. But now those same meetings felt different. David would still ask for opinions, but he had a way of dismissing ideas that didn't align with his vision. He never said no directly. Instead, he would nod thoughtfully and say things like, "That's interesting, but have we considered the broader implications?" Or, "I appreciate the creativity, but let's focus on more practical solutions." His team members started to feel like their contributions weren't valued anymore. Jennifer, who had been with the company for 5 years, noticed that her carefully researched proposals were being overlooked in favor of David's quick decisions. When she tried to discuss this with him privately, David was polite but condescending. He explained that as a senior manager, he had access to information and strategic insights that she couldn't see from her position. It wasn't personal, he assured her, it was just business hierarchy. But the changes went beyond just dismissing input. David had started taking credit for his team's work in increasingly bold ways. When the team developed an innovative solution to streamline their inventory management system, David presented it to senior management as his own initiative. He mentioned the team's support in implementing his vision, but the way he told the story made it clear that the creative breakthrough was his alone. The most frustrating part for his team was how skillfully David managed this narrative. He never outright lied about who came up with an idea. Instead, he would reframe the situation so that he appeared to be the strategic mind behind every success. If someone questioned the origin of an idea, David would smile and say something like, "Great teams make their leaders look good, and I'm lucky to have such a great team." It sounded humble, but it reinforced the impression that he was the driving force behind their achievements. David's relationship with his direct supervisor, Patricia, had also become complicated. Patricia was a respected director who had been with TechFlow Solutions for over 8 years. She had initially been pleased with David's promotion and his early performance. But she started noticing that David was making decisions without consulting her and then informing her after the fact. The pattern became clear during a quarterly review meeting. Patricia discovered that David had approved a significant budget reallocation for his department without her knowledge. When she asked him about it, David explained that he had identified an urgent need to upgrade their software systems and had acted quickly to secure the best pricing from vendors. He presented detailed cost-benefit analyses and pointed out that the decision had already proven successful. Patricia couldn't argue with the results, but the process bothered her. David was supposed to get approval for budget changes over a certain threshold. He had exceeded his authority, even if the outcome was positive. When she mentioned this to David, he apologized for the oversight, but suggested that perhaps their approval processes were slowing down important decisions. Maybe they needed to reconsider the chain of command for certain operational choices. This conversation was a turning point. David had essentially suggested that Patricia's oversight was unnecessary bureaucracy that hindered his effectiveness. He did it diplomatically, but the message was clear. He believed he should have more autonomy to make decisions without interference from above. Around this time, David also began cultivating relationships with executives outside of his direct reporting line. He started attending networking events and industry conferences where he could interact with senior leadership from other departments. He was careful never to badmouth Patricia or anyone else in his chain of command, but he made sure these executives knew about his successes and innovative thinking. David discovered that he had a talent for making himself memorable to important people. He would research their backgrounds and interests before events, then find natural ways to connect with them on personal topics. He remembered details about their families, their hobbies, and their professional achievements. These executives began to see David as an impressive up-and-comer who really understood the business. His networking efforts paid off when the VP of Operations mentioned David's name during a leadership meeting. He praised David's entrepreneurial thinking and suggested that the company needed more managers who weren't afraid to take initiative. Patricia was in that meeting and felt an uncomfortable twist in her stomach as she realized that David had been building relationships above her level without her knowledge. But perhaps the most concerning change was how David began treating the people below him in the company hierarchy. His charm and political skills had always been directed upward toward people who could help his career. With subordinates, he was becoming increasingly demanding and less patient with mistakes. Michael, a junior analyst on David's team, made an error in a client report that required some additional work to correct. In the past, this kind of mistake would have been handled with a private conversation and some coaching. But David's response was different this time. He called a team meeting where he discussed the importance of attention to detail without naming Michael specifically, but making it obvious who he was talking about. Michael sat there feeling humiliated while David used his mistake as a teaching moment for the entire team. The message was clear. David's standards were high, and he wouldn't tolerate carelessness. But the way he handled it created an atmosphere of fear rather than motivation. Team members started double and triple checking their work, not because they wanted to excel, but because they were afraid of being singled out for public criticism. David also began using company resources in ways that weren't technically against policy, but weren't entirely appropriate either. He started hosting client development dinners at expensive restaurants, where the guest lists included potential business contacts who weren't actually clients yet. These events were charged to his department's business development budget, and David always made sure to invite at least one legitimate client to justify the expense. But the real purpose of these dinners was to expand David's professional network and raise his profile in the industry. He was building a personal brand that positioned him as a thought leader and innovator. The line between what was good for the company and what was good for David's career was becoming increasingly blurred. Patricia started getting subtle feedback from other departments about David's activities. Nothing concrete enough to warrant formal action, but enough to make her pay closer attention to his behavior. She heard that he had been in direct contact with clients about strategic initiatives that should have been coordinated through her office. She learned about meetings he had scheduled with senior executives that she hadn't been informed about. When Patricia tried to address these concerns with David, he was always prepared with reasonable explanations. He was just being proactive about client relationships. He was taking advantage of networking opportunities to benefit the company. He was showing initiative that would help TechFlow Solutions stay competitive in a rapidly changing market. David had become expert at walking right up to the line of acceptable behavior without clearly crossing it. He was using his position and the company's resources to advance his own agenda. but he was doing it skillfully enough that calling him out would make Patricia look petty or jealous of his success. The most troubling aspect of David's transformation was that he seemed to genuinely believe his own narrative. He wasn't consciously trying to deceive anyone or undermine the company. In his mind, what was good for his career was naturally good for TechFlow Solutions. He had convinced himself that his success and the company's success were the same thing. This belief would soon lead him to make decisions that were far more dangerous than anything he had done so far. David was about to discover that there was a significant difference between bending rules and breaking them, and that difference would have consequences he never saw coming. The opportunity that would ultimately destroy David's career arrived in the form of an email on a Tuesday morning in March. Global Tech Industries, one of the largest technology companies in the region, was soliciting bids for a comprehensive software integration project. The contract was worth $45 million over 3 years, making it the largest potential deal in TechFlow Solutions history. David read through the request for proposal with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of transformative opportunity that could establish him as a key player in the company's future. The project involved modernizing Global Tech's entire operational software infrastructure, something that played directly to TechFlow's strengths. More importantly, it was the kind of high-profile success that could accelerate his career trajectory significantly. The standard procedure for major proposals like this involved a collaborative effort between multiple departments. Patricia would typically lead the response team, with input from sales, technical services, finance, and legal. The process usually took several weeks of careful planning and coordination to ensure that every aspect of the proposal was accurate and feasible. But David saw this timeline as a weakness rather than a strength. He had been following Global Tech's business moves for months and knew they were under pressure to complete their system upgrade quickly. Their current software was causing significant operational inefficiencies, and their board of directors was demanding immediate action. David believed that a fast, decisive response would give TechFlow a significant advantage over competitors who would inevitably get bogged down in bureaucratic processes. David made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of following the established protocol, he decided to take personal control of the proposal process. He told himself that he was being entrepreneurial and showing the kind of leadership initiative that executives valued. After all, hadn't his previous unconventional approaches led to success? He started by researching Global Tech's specific needs and challenges. David had always been thorough in his preparation, and this project was no exception. He studied their current systems, analyzed their operational requirements, and identified areas where TechFlow could provide significant value. His analysis was actually quite impressive and demonstrated a deep understanding of both companies' capabilities. The problem wasn't David's technical competence or business insight. The problem was that he began making commitments and promises without proper authorization or consultation with the teams who would actually have to deliver on those commitments. David reached out directly to Global Tech's project manager, introducing himself as TechFlow's lead representative for their software integration needs. He scheduled a series of meetings and phone calls where he positioned himself as the primary point of contact for all discussions about the project. This bypassed Patricia entirely and created the impression that David had full authority to negotiate on behalf of TechFlow Solutions. In these conversations, David was confident and persuasive. He spoke knowledgeably about technical requirements and implementation timelines. But more concerning, he began making specific promises about pricing and delivery schedules without consulting with the departments that would actually handle those aspects of the project. David promised Global Tech that TechFlow could complete the entire integration 6 months faster than industry standards, which would save them millions in operational costs. He quoted pricing that was 15% below their closest competitor, claiming that TechFlow's efficiency and innovative processes made this possible. He even suggested that TechFlow's CEO would personally oversee the project to ensure its success. None of these promises had been approved by anyone else at TechFlow Solutions. David had essentially created his own proposal based on what he thought the company could deliver, rather than what had been properly analyzed and approved through normal channels. To make matters worse, David realized he needed documentation to support his negotiations with Global Tech. The client was asking for detailed technical specifications, financial projections, and formal commitments that he couldn't provide through verbal discussions alone. This is where David made his most serious mistake. He used his access to company systems to create unofficial proposal documents using TechFlow's standard templates and formatting. But since he didn't have authorization to submit a formal proposal, he couldn't use the normal approval process. Instead, David forged Patricia's electronic signature on several key documents, including a preliminary contract outline and a financial commitment letter. David justified this decision by telling himself that he was streamlining the process and eliminating unnecessary delays. He planned to get proper approvals after Global Tech expressed serious interest in moving forward. In his mind, he was taking calculated risks that would benefit everyone involved once the deal was completed. But David had fundamentally misunderstood both the technical and financial realities of what he was promising. The accelerated timeline he had committed to would require overtime work from multiple departments and would likely necessitate hiring additional temporary staff. The pricing he had quoted was based on best-case scenarios that didn't account for potential complications or cost overruns that were common in large integration projects. Most seriously, David had promised that TechFlow's CEO would personally oversee the project. This wasn't just an empty marketing promise. Global Tech's executives took this commitment seriously and began planning their project timeline around the assumption that they would have direct access to TechFlow's top leadership throughout the implementation process. As David continued his unauthorized negotiations, he found himself in an increasingly complex web of commitments and promises. Each conversation with Global Tech seemed to require additional concessions or guarantees to keep their interest level high. David was essentially bidding against phantom competitors, trying to make TechFlow's offer so attractive that Global Tech couldn't refuse. The irony was that TechFlow Solutions probably could have won the contract through normal channels. They were a respected company with a strong track record and competitive capabilities. But David's unauthorized approach had created unrealistic expectations that would be difficult or impossible for the company to meet. David's behavior during this period became increasingly secretive and erratic. He scheduled meetings with Global Tech during times when Patricia was traveling or in other meetings. He used conference rooms that weren't normally booked through the central scheduling system. He even started having some conversations from his car in the parking lot to avoid being overheard by colleagues. His team members noticed that David seemed distracted and stressed, but they attributed it to the normal pressures of managing a busy department. They had no idea that he was essentially running a shadow operation that could have significant implications for the entire company. The situation reached a critical point when Global Tech's executives decided they were ready to move forward with TechFlow's proposal. They scheduled a formal meeting to finalize the contract terms and begin the implementation planning process. Most importantly, they specifically requested that TechFlow's CEO attend this meeting to discuss her personal involvement in the project. David realized that he could no longer handle the situation on his own. The commitments he had made were about to become formal contractual obligations, and there was no way to hide his unauthorized activities from senior management. But instead of coming clean about what he had done, David made one final, desperate decision. He decided to try to convince Patricia and the CEO that Global Tech had specifically sought out TechFlow for this project and that the terms they were offering were too good to pass up. He would present the opportunity as if it had developed through normal business channels, hoping that the potential value of the contract would overshadow any questions about how the negotiations had been conducted. David scheduled a meeting with Patricia and prepared a presentation that highlighted the project's potential value while downplaying the specific commitments he had made. He planned to frame the discussion around TechFlow's exciting opportunity to win their largest contract ever, hoping that the financial incentives would distract from the procedural irregularities. But David had underestimated both Patricia's experience and the CEO's attention to detail. They were about to discover not just what David had done, but how his actions had potentially exposed TechFlow Solutions to significant financial and legal risks. The meeting that David hoped would secure his greatest professional triumph was about to become the beginning of his downfall. Rebecca Martinez had built TechFlow Solutions from a small consulting firm with 3 employees into a major player in the technology integration industry. As CEO, she had learned to pay attention to details that others might overlook, and she had developed an instinct for spotting potential problems before they became crises. That instinct was triggered by an unexpected phone call on a Thursday afternoon. "Rebecca, this is Tom Wilson from Global Tech Industries," the voice on the other end said warmly. "I wanted to personally thank you for your commitment to our integration project. Having the CEO directly involved in implementation is exactly the kind of partnership approach we were hoping to find." Rebecca paused, her pen hovering over the quarterly budget report she had been reviewing. She had no idea what Tom Wilson was talking about. TechFlow Solutions had submitted dozens of proposals over the past few months, but she couldn't recall any recent communications with Global Tech Industries, and she certainly hadn't made any personal commitments to oversee their projects. "I appreciate the call, Tom," Rebecca said carefully, "but I want to make sure we're on the same page about the details. Could you remind me which specific project you're referring to?" Tom seemed surprised by the question. "The comprehensive software integration project, of course. The $45 million contract over 3 years. Your operations manager, David, has been fantastic to work with. He really understands our needs and has put together an impressive proposal." Rebecca felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She was familiar with every major proposal and contract negotiation that TechFlow was involved in, and this wasn't one of them. More concerning was the mention of David making commitments on behalf of the company without her knowledge or approval. "Tom, I'm going to need to review some internal documents and get back to you," Rebecca said, keeping her voice professional despite her growing alarm. "Can I call you back tomorrow morning?" After ending the call, Rebecca immediately contacted Patricia, David's direct supervisor. Patricia was in a client meeting, but Rebecca left an urgent message asking her to come to her office as soon as possible. While she waited, Rebecca began searching through company records for any mention of Global Tech Industries or related communications. What she found was troubling. There were several entries in David's calendar for meetings with Global Tech representatives, but no corresponding entries in the company's official client relationship management system. No formal proposal had been submitted through their standard process, and no one in the sales or legal departments had any record of discussions with this potential client. When Patricia arrived at Rebecca's office an hour later, she could see immediately that something was seriously wrong. Rebecca explained about the phone call from Tom Wilson and the apparent unauthorized negotiations that David had been conducting. Patricia's face went pale as Rebecca described the situation. "I've been concerned about some of David's activities lately," she admitted. "He's been making decisions without consulting me and seems to be building relationships outside our normal reporting structure. But I had no idea he was negotiating contracts without authorization," Rebecca asked Patricia to discreetly gather all available information about David's recent activities while she continued her own investigation. They agreed not to confront David until they had a complete understanding of what he had been doing and what commitments he might have made on behalf of the company. Over the next 24 hours, Rebecca and Patricia uncovered the full scope of David's unauthorized activities. The evidence was comprehensive and damaging. David had been conducting negotiations with Global Tech for over 6 weeks, making specific promises about pricing, timelines, and service levels that were far beyond what TechFlow could realistically deliver. The financial implications were staggering. David had quoted prices that were below TechFlow's actual costs for similar projects, apparently believing that the company's efficiency could make up the difference. But Rebecca's analysis showed that fulfilling the contract under the terms David had discussed would actually cost TechFlow money rather than generate profit. Even more concerning were the timeline commitments. David had promised completion schedules that would require massive overtime expenses and possibly hiring dozens of temporary workers. The technical specifications he had agreed to exceeded what TechFlow's current systems could handle without significant infrastructure investments. Rebecca also discovered that David had been using forged electronic signatures to create official-looking documents for his negotiations with Global Tech. He had copied Patricia's signature authorization from legitimate documents and applied it to contracts and proposals that had never been properly reviewed or approved. But perhaps the most serious issue was David's promise that Rebecca would personally oversee the Global Tech project. This wasn't just a casual marketing statement. Global Tech's executives had structured their entire project timeline around the assumption that they would have direct access to TechFlow's CEO throughout the implementation process. They had even scheduled board presentations highlighting this commitment as a key factor in their vendor selection. Rebecca realized that David's actions had created a situation where TechFlow Solutions faced three equally unacceptable options. They could try to honor the commitments David had made, which would likely result in significant financial losses and could compromise their ability to serve other clients. They could withdraw from the negotiations, which would damage their reputation and potentially expose them to legal action for breach of preliminary agreements. Or they could try to renegotiate the terms, which would require admitting that their representative had exceeded his authority and made unauthorized commitments. The legal implications were also concerning. Rebecca consulted with TechFlow's attorney, who explained that David's use of forged signatures and unauthorized contract negotiations could potentially expose both him and the company to fraud charges. Even though David's intentions might not have been malicious, the legal system doesn't always distinguish between incompetence and criminal intent when it comes to contract law. Rebecca also learned that David's unauthorized activities weren't limited to the Global Tech situation. Her investigation revealed a pattern of behavior where David had been gradually exceeding his authority and operating outside normal company protocols. He had been making financial commitments, scheduling meetings with senior executives from other companies, and even using company resources for personal networking activities. The most troubling discovery was how skillfully David had hidden these activities from oversight. He had been careful to schedule unauthorized meetings when Patricia was unavailable, and had used his access to company systems to create documents that looked official but hadn't gone through proper approval processes. Rebecca realized that David had essentially been operating his own independent business development operation within TechFlow Solutions, making commitments and promises that could have serious consequences for the entire company. His actions demonstrated either a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate authority structures or a deliberate decision to ignore them. As Rebecca prepared to confront David about his unauthorized activities, she also had to consider the broader implications for TechFlow Solutions. How had one manager been able to operate so far outside normal protocols without being detected? What changes would be needed to prevent similar situations in the future? And how could the company maintain its reputation and client relationships while addressing the mess that David had created? The confrontation with David would need to be handled carefully. Rebecca wanted to give him an opportunity to explain his actions and possibly cooperate in finding solutions to the problems he had created. But she also needed to protect TechFlow Solutions from further damage and ensure that all legal and ethical obligations were met. Rebecca scheduled a meeting with David for the following morning, asking Patricia and the company's legal counsel to attend as well. She prepared a comprehensive file documenting all of David's unauthorized activities and their potential consequences. The meeting would be David's opportunity to explain himself, but Rebecca suspected that his explanations would only confirm what she already knew. David had allowed his ambition and confidence to override his judgment, and the consequences were about to catch up with him in ways he had never imagined. The same traits that had helped him advance in his career were about to destroy it, and Rebecca was going to have to be the one to deliver that reality check. David walked into the conference room Friday morning, expecting to discuss what he believed would be the biggest success of his career. He had spent the previous evening preparing a presentation about the global tech opportunity, complete with charts showing potential revenue growth and market expansion possibilities. In his mind, this meeting would be his moment to demonstrate his value to the company and possibly secure his next promotion. The scene that greeted him was not what he had anticipated. Rebecca sat at the head of the conference table with a thick manila folder in front of her. Patricia was there along with James Rodriguez, the company's legal counsel, and Linda Chen from Human Resources. The formal arrangement and serious expressions on their faces should have been warning signs, but David's confidence in his own abilities made him misread the situation. "Good morning, everyone," David said with his usual charm, setting down his laptop and presentation materials. "I'm excited to share the details about this global tech opportunity. I think you're going to be impressed with what we can accomplish here." Rebecca's expression didn't change. "David, please have a seat. We need to discuss your recent activities with global tech industries, but not in the way you're expecting." The tone of Rebecca's voice finally penetrated David's optimistic assumptions. He sat down slowly, his confident smile beginning to fade as he noticed the legal counsel taking notes and the formal documentation spread across the table. "David," Rebecca continued, opening the manila folder. "Yesterday I received a phone call from Tom Wilson at Global Tech Industries. He was thanking me for my personal commitment to oversee their integration project. The problem is I had no idea what he was talking about. Can you explain how Global Tech came to believe that I had made such a commitment?" David felt his first flutter of real concern, but his instinct was still to try to control the narrative. "Well, Rebecca, I've been developing a relationship with Global Tech over the past few weeks. They expressed interest in working with us, and I may have mentioned that our leadership takes a hands-on approach with major clients. I was trying to emphasize our commitment to customer service." Rebecca pulled out a printed email from the folder. "This is a message you sent to Global Tech's project manager 3 days ago. In it, you specifically state that CEO Rebecca Martinez will personally oversee all phases of your integration project and will be available for weekly progress meetings throughout the implementation process." This isn't a casual mention of hands-on leadership. David, this is a specific contractual commitment that you made without my knowledge or consent. David's throat began to feel dry. "I understand how that might look concerning, but I was confident that once you saw the value of this opportunity, you would want to be involved. The contract is worth $45 million over 3 years. It would be the largest deal in our company's history." Patricia leaned forward. "David, we've reviewed all of your communications with Global Tech. You've made commitments about pricing, timelines, and service levels that are completely unrealistic. The financial terms you've quoted would actually result in a net loss for our company. Did you consult with anyone in finance or operations before making these promises?" The room felt like it was closing in on David. "I did my own analysis based on our historical performance data. I believed that our efficiency improvements would allow us to deliver the project profitably within those parameters." James, the legal counsel, spoke for the first time. "David, we've also discovered that you used electronic signatures without authorization. You applied Patricia's signature to several documents that were never reviewed or approved through our standard processes. Can you explain why you felt this was appropriate?" David's carefully constructed confidence was beginning to crumble. He could see the trap closing around him, but his instinct was still to try to justify his actions rather than admit wrongdoing. "I was trying to respond quickly to Global Tech's needs. They were considering multiple vendors, and I knew that bureaucratic delays could cost us the opportunity. I planned to get proper approvals once they committed to moving forward with us." Rebecca's voice remained calm but firm. "David, what you're describing is fraud. You forged official company signatures and made unauthorized financial commitments that could have exposed TechFlow Solutions to millions of dollars in losses. This isn't about bureaucratic delays or missed opportunities. This is about fundamental violations of company policy and potentially criminal behavior." The word criminal hit David like a physical blow. For the first time, he began to understand the true severity of his situation. "Rebecca, I never intended to harm the company. Everything I did was meant to benefit TechFlow Solutions. I was trying to secure the largest contract in our history." Linda from Human Resources opened her own folder. "David, our investigation has revealed that this pattern of unauthorized behavior extends beyond the Global Tech situation. We've documented multiple instances where you've exceeded your authority, made commitments without proper approval, and used company resources for activities that weren't properly authorized. This isn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. This represents a systematic pattern of misconduct." David looked around the table, finally realizing that this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion about moving forward with Global Tech. This was a disciplinary hearing, and the outcome had probably already been decided. "What exactly are you saying?" Rebecca's expression remained professional but resolute. "David, effective immediately. You are terminated from your position with TechFlow Solutions. Your access to company systems has been revoked, and security will escort you from the building. We are also conducting a comprehensive audit of all your activities to determine whether additional legal action may be necessary." David's world seemed to tilt off its axis. You can't be serious. I brought value to this company. I increased productivity in my department. I secured new business relationships. One mistake shouldn't overshadow everything I've accomplished. James leaned forward. David, this isn't one mistake. Our investigation has uncovered systematic violations of company policy, fraudulent use of electronic signatures, and unauthorized financial commitments that could have bankrupted certain departments. The global tech situation alone could have exposed the company to breach of contract lawsuits and significant financial penalties. David made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. But what about the potential value of the global tech contract?
Even if my approach was unconventional, the underlying opportunity is still valid.
We could renegotiate the terms and still move forward. Rebecca shook her head. David, your unauthorized actions have made it impossible for us to maintain a professional relationship with Global Tech. I spent 2 hours on the phone with their executives yesterday, explaining that our representative had exceeded his authority and that the commitments you made were not valid. We may be able to salvage some possibility of future business with them, but only after we've demonstrated that we have proper oversight and control over our business development processes. Patricia added, the damage extends beyond just this one client. Your behavior has created trust issues within your team and raised concerns about our company's internal controls. Several of your team members have come forward with concerns about your management style and decision-making processes. David sat in stunned silence as the full impact of the situation became clear. His career at TechFlow Solutions was over, and his professional reputation was likely damaged beyond repair. The same ambition and confidence that had driven his early success had ultimately led to his complete downfall. Security will be here in a few minutes to escort you out, Rebecca said. You'll receive information about your final paycheck and benefits through HR. I would strongly recommend that you consult with your own attorney about the potential legal implications of your actions. As David gathered his personal belongings, under the watchful eye of a security guard, he couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had unraveled. 6 months ago, he had been seen as a rising star with unlimited potential. Now he was leaving the building in disgrace, facing possible legal action and the certainty that his professional reputation was destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on him. His desire to prove himself and advance his career had led him to take risks that ultimately destroyed everything he had worked to build. The same traits that had initially made him successful, ambition, confidence, and willingness to break conventional rules, had become the instruments of his professional destruction. Rebecca watched David leave the building and then turned her attention to the significant task of repairing the damage he had caused. She would need to rebuild trust with Global Tech, implement new oversight procedures, and restore confidence among David's former team members. The cost of David's ambition would be measured not just in the opportunities lost, but in the time and resources required to rebuild what his actions had damaged. The story served as a reminder that true authority comes with responsibility, and that success built on manipulation and unauthorized actions is ultimately unsustainable. David had learned too late that there's a crucial difference between leadership and simply having power, and that difference had cost him everything he thought he wanted.